back to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida where we explore the ways big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. The name Seeking Rents, it comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what happens when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses that wealth and influence to get laws changed in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Today is going to be another conversation episode where we're going to talk to a guest. And, the first one we did focused on some of the advocates who've been involved in the effort in Florida to try and establish heat illness protections for outdoor workers, essentially ensuring, folks like roofers and farm workers and construction workers are guaranteed access to like just basic things like drinking water and shade and periodic breaks on, 100-degree days. As, and most folks who follow Florida politics probably know the Governor Ron DeSantis of the Florida Legislature essentially put a bullet in that effort this past year when they passed a bill, House Bill 433, that, among other things, prohibits any local government in Florida, any city, county, or town from passing any kind of heat illness protection ordinance that might offer some measure of protection to outdoor workers. That law that they passed is what's known as a preemption. A preemption, it's kind of a wonky term, but basically that's what's happening when state government steps in and takes powers away from a local government. So we've seen this all across the state in lots of different ways. Just here where I am in Orlando, we've seen local efforts to guarantee workers at large employers the right to paid sick leave. We've seen efforts to impose emergency rent control. We've seen efforts to strengthen environmental protections or protections for rural areas, all of which the legislature has then stepped in and attempted to preempt either after the fact or before any sort of local policy can be finalized. And so that's what prompted me to bring on today's guest. Today's guest is going to be Danny Rivero. He's an investigative reporter for WLRN, the public radio station in Miami. He is, for my money, one of the very best public policy reporters in Florida. He's doing great work on everything from insurance to local real estate and development issues. But the reason I wanted to have Danny on this particular show, following up on last week's, is a couple of years ago, he produced a series called Tallahassee Takeover. And what it was an in-depth look at how much preemption is happening across the state. The whole series is utterly fascinating. I would encourage you to listen to it. This ran in late 2021, early 2022. It is every bit as relevant today. You get a sense of just how vast this is across the state now, just how many powers and how many different places Tallahassee is in like eroding home rule authority in everywhere from, Miami to Pensacola. And so we're going to talk today about preemption with Danny Rivero, who, I think it's probably one of the state's leading experts on this subject. So I hope you'll enjoy the conversation, and it starts now. Danny Rivero, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on here, because you do a lot of great work. For my money, you are one of the best public policy reporters in the state. But the series you did a couple of years ago, Tallahassee Takeover, I thought was one of the more comprehensive looks I've seen anybody do at this, and sort of like covering all the different ways preemption is starting to affect like communities across the state and all the different powers that are being taken away, that sort of thing. So I guess just to open this up, maybe tell me how you sort of went down that path. How did you get interested in preemption so comprehensively? Like what was sort of the seeds or the origin story of Tallahassee Takeover?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. The series actually started from a series of observations I had and other people in the newsroom had, where it seemed at some point that every time we were talking about something like our local government was trying to do in Miami-Dade County or the city of Miami or Miami Beach, whoever, it seemed like almost every time there was efforts to do something locally, a couple of months later, the state would do something to shoot it down and make all that effort, all the debate and everything irrelevant, like after the fact. Something would happen, there'd be arguments, debates. We have unanimous votes on a lot of items with a lot of Republicans and Democrats coming together and doing something. And then afterwards, the state government coming in and saying, no, actually, you can't do that. And this happened like over and over and over. And it was like an ongoing topic of conversation in the newsroom. And then we started saying like, well, why don't we actually make it a series and do it? And then, I'm kind of just the one that ended up raising my hand and like hosting it and really putting it together. But it was kind of a collective effort in like identifying the problem.
That makes sense. Yeah. One of the things that I'm always struck by is on a local level, sort of like you're alluding to, a lot of this stuff, the policies that get passed are bipartisan, right? There's not the same obvious partisan breakdown, but then it goes to Tallahassee and it's almost entirely like hardcore partisanship when it comes to these preemptions. And obviously Republicans have a super majority up there. So what they want to do goes for the most part. Do you remember, was there like a specific one that was kind of for you or your staff that was kind of like a tripping point or a snapping point that like sort of made you guys think like we need to step back and take a deeper look at this?
Yeah, for me, there was one in the area actually where our station is located, like where our studio is pretty much right in downtown Miami. There was like this one area that has a CRA, a community revitaliz. Oh, I'm butchering that. And the city came up with some legislation that was debated and ultimately passed in a Republican-run city commission. But basically, the result of it was, okay, like in this area, we're going to require some percentage of affordable or workforce housing in these new developments. And there was a carrot and stick approach to it. It's like, we'll give you a couple more floors of development, you can do it, but you have to hit these benchmarks set forth by the city. And just like 2 or so months later, the state came in and they passed a whole law basically undoing specifically what Miami did. And then,
Wow.
when that happened, it was before COVID, and we were already looking at, we have a housing problem here, big
Right.
housing problem. And there was a lot of hope that policies like this could be almost pilot programs to maybe expand and do something more, an experiment in democracy. It was very localized, like, within 10 square blocks or so, where there's a lot of development.
Right.
And even something very modest, pilot, bipartisan like that, to even think about addressing the problem was just totally kneecapped. And then, I was scratching my head and talking to policy and housing people, and they were like, if we can't do that, what can we do? Like, what
Right.
tools are left in our toolkit to do anything about this? And so that
Do
in
you,
particular
oh,
really got me thinking on it.
that makes sense. Do you remember who? I don't remember that issue at all. Do you remember who like what was there a specific lobby that kind of went running to Tallahassee for help, or like who was pushing for that preemption?
Good question. Cannot remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's right. That's all right. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. That's fascinating. And so,
I mean,
another
it
thing I
kind of
wanted
flew
to,
under the radar. Like, it barely got reported
yeah, right.
statewide. It was a super local issue. But
Yeah,
Tallahassee
right.
was
And that,
making decisions about it.
yeah, that's right. And even in that situation, if I'm understanding you right, you're talking about like carrots, incentives for development stuff, like the sort of stuff that generally philosophically Republicans in Tallahassee seem to, they're very anti-stick, at least when it comes to sort of regulating businesses, but usually pretty pro carrot with incentives and stuff like that. And even that's getting preempted because I can only assume somebody didn't like the way the incentives were being sort of used or allocated.
I mean, the way that it came down, and part of the argument against it was that it wasn't just incentives, it was requirements. And when you
Oh, okay.
and in like, the incentive part was, we will let you build higher in this area, but the requirement is you make X amount of these units,
Yeah, yeah,
income
like a
tax.
density bonus sort of thing.
Exactly. So it
Right.
was looked upon as a requirement, big government, requiring you to do something and not an incentive. And that was where the debate was.
Wow. So bigger government comes along and says, no, you can't do this. Uh, so one thing about Tallahassee Takeover, that series, that aired, if memory serves, right? That was like late 2021, early 2022, because there's a lot of COVID stuff at the time. Obviously, this whole issue of sort of usurping local power and eroding home rule has continued since then. I just actually recorded a show with a bunch of folks, advocates for immigrants and farm workers that had worked on heat illness prevention, and that just got preempted. As you sort of have followed the issue since then, are there Are there preemptions or sort of home rule issues since then that stand out to you that have struck you as particularly sort of whether interesting, egregious, whatever way they stick out to you? Just sort of curious ones that have jumped out at you.
Right. I mean, well, there's two items passed in Tallahassee that reversed things that were passed on a bipartisan basis by the Miami-Dade County Commission, the most populous county in the state of Florida.
Right.
One of them was called the local Tenant Bill of Rights, a piece of
Yes.
legislation, which was actually sponsored by, at the time, the chair of the Republican Party of Miami-Dade County.
Wow.
Right? Like Rene Garcia, former state senator, he sponsored that. It was passed unanimously. It just like outlined, if you're a tenant in, this housing crisis that we have, and in many ways we are the epicenter of the housing crisis in the country right here. Just like, what are your rights? What rights do you have as someone who's renting? It was the result of a lot of advocacy, a lot of discussions, street protests, etc., lobbying. It was unanimously passed. It was considered a huge victory for a lot of people across the entire community. And then you had Tallahassee just reverse it. And then like all that discussion and bipartisan nature of it is just like wiped out. And then, another one was the heat protections. Miami-Dade County, we were, as a result, again, of years and years of lobbying of the farm worker groups down here, especially We Count down in Homestead, which is one of the most important agricultural areas in the whole state, really advocating for some form of protection for extreme heat. And, it got watered down somewhat, but, the county was basically doing it. And then Tallahassee, just a couple months ago, they did a statewide preemption. They said, absolutely not. Miami-Dade County won't do this. And in fact, no one else will do it. So then, now the Biden administration is stepping in. It looks like they might do some federal regulations to kind of do part of the same things. But I mean, those were two bipartisan, like massive pieces of legislation that there was years of development behind. This didn't just pop out of nowhere. This wasn't something that wasn't publicly aired or something like that. And then, Tallahassee just undoes it.
Yeah, the Tenant Bill of Rights one is really interesting. So if it's what I'm remembering correctly, like it had like just basic stuff like if you're going to raise the rent more than 5%, I think it was in some places, then you got to give like a month's notice or 2 months notice. I can't remember the exact details, but it was that kind of thing. And if I'm also remembering it right, that eventually spread across the state. I think you had, if I'm going off memory, so don't like hold me directionally, but there were more than a dozen communities across the state, like places like St. Pete or Orange County had done it. I think Gainesville had done it, had variations of these tenants' Bill of Rights. And by the end, and I know this only because I remember writing a bit about the preemption that came along, more than 1.5 million renters in Florida were protected by these tenants' Bill of Rights. But then the Florida Apartment Association was the lead lobby on that when they come along, and they literally stripped those rights for more than 1.5 million people. And to the point you're making is, well, these ordinances locally tend to be the subject of like enormous amounts of debate, because like the same lobbies that have influence in Tallahassee, they also lobby against them locally and stuff. The preemptions often show up, a month or two before they pass into law, right? It's like they take it away overnight. And I guess this is going to lead to a question because here I am just sort of like monopolizing the time. But when you were looking at these, was your sense or what was your, how would you say, like, how did the sort of amount of evaluation and debate and public sort of discussion on the original ordinances compare to the amount of sort of public debate and analysis that would go into the preemptions taking it away? Was there an imbalance there typically, or did you see a lot of debate usually on the stuff you guys looked at?
At the local level, for passing these kinds of regulations or ordinances or whatnot, there does tend to be a lot of public debate. There's a lot of public concern on all sides of any given issue, to be honest. And these are not things that pop up one day and they're voted on the next day. These are things that, you know, sometimes it's years of advocacy and talking about it that gets something
Right.
across the line. But I have seen, you know, once it goes to Tallahassee, there is very little debate on it. And then the debate that it's undertaken, it's almost like not serious debate, because
Right.
you very clearly see that there are people that are not open for persuasion. Like the order has
Right.
already come down that we're going to vote on this and we're going to do this, and whatever these people say, you know, you get a sense that it doesn't matter, and
Right.
they're just going to vote on it, basically whatever anyone says about it. And then, you know, sometimes, as you know, as I went into in the episode I did about the minimum wage, um, you know, which ended up becoming a statewide ballot referendum, sometimes that can really backfire, actually.
Right.
And
Right.
you know, the state in by, you know, bigfooting itself around, um, really ends up in some way potentially screwing everyone over.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Because you made the point that that episode was fascinating. The as that episode was playing out, I remember sort of like screaming for myself because it felt so obvious, and then eventually you were just sort of setting it up and turned there. But like how minimum wage hurts like rural, like a higher minimum wage hurts rural communities where the cost of living isn't nearly as high. But essentially, the legislature, by refusing to allow like Miami Beach to have a higher local wage, essentially ended up getting a higher minimum wage for, you know, Levy County and Dixie County
It's
too, right?
absurd. I mean, it's
Right.
absurd, and you know, it's really something that, like, the strength of how our political system is designed, you know, like there's how we treat it in some level where everything is nationalized or whatever, but like the way that it's designed is like very bottom up, you know, like every municipality, every county should have a lot of control to do things that they want to do in order to have those decisions that are made on that level kind of filter up when it works, right? Like something works in a city, okay, the county can try it. Okay, works in the county, the state will try it. Okay, now maybe we'll have a national law on it, right? Like it filters up. But with something like minimum wage, when there's such obvious differences between Miami Beach, which is in a very wealthy area, the cost of living is extremely high. The state refused to let the city raise the minimum wage, and you know, voters wanted it to be raised. There was even some you know, some businesses that were kind of in favor of it because they were paying higher wages anyways. And you know, so Miami Beach passed it, they did it. They, you know, the I forget the name of the restaurant and lodging group basically took the
Yeah, Florida Restaurant and Lodging
right.
Association.
They took him to court. They went up to the Florida Supreme Court, and then the Florida Supreme Court said, "Yeah, you already can't do that in the first place, right? Like this was something that was preempted years and years ago. Miami Beach was trying to, you know, push it and see if they could get around it somehow because the language was vaguely worded. They weren't successful. But then what was the result? Miami Beach, Miami-Dade County in general became the epicenter for the ballot amendment to put it on a statewide ballot. So then in a lot of ways, as I showed in that episode, because Miami Beach couldn't do it, the backlash is the people organized across the state and did it across the state, even though it doesn't make sense across the state.
Right.
You know, in Putnam County, I don't think they necessarily, you know, like needed or
Right.
wanted it. I mean, it's the median income in many areas of Florida is below $15 an hour, right? And
Right.
depending on where you are, there's like huge variances. But if you don't allow any decision making based on those factors, then you're going to make it flat across the board. And what people basically did in Florida was say, okay, we're going to make it flat across the board. We're going to make it high. And you know, I know economists are studying this right now, how it's actually playing out in Florida. Is how is this going to impact those lower income areas?
Right.
And they felt off the bat that it was probably going to hurt them.
Yeah, it's like I mean, any sort of common sense policy making would acknowledge that there is a difference in sort of the needs and sort of regulations you need in a place like Miami versus a place like Palatka. And I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for like Olive Garden, right? Um, I'll come back to like, I want to come back to that Miami Beach court stuff in just a bit, but sort of more broadly too, like my sort of sense of watching this stuff is I in my mind, I kind of lump most preemptions into, I feel like they mostly fall in one of two categories. There's like sort of like the corporate driven preemption where it's a business is unhappy with some regulation it's facing in Orlando or Miami or some industry group like landlords or realtors. And then there's also just kind of like I don't know the best way to phrase it, but I think of it like political power or partisan preemptions, like where you're trying to sort of either maintain your control in Tallahassee or weaken control of like, Democrats tend to be in power in most of these cities and stuff. So that's how I kind of think. But I'm, as someone who's looked pretty deeply at this stuff, what's your sense of like where are the different motivations you typically see for preemptions? What are the different, how would you kind of like group various preemptions that we've
Yeah,
seen?
and I think I would add a third category to those, because it's not to say that like preemption as an idea is inherently bad. The question is like how is it being used, right? So there was something a couple of years ago, which was another thing that like I was like, oh, that's an interesting point. There were different cities have different policies for any number of things, and I think it was the city of North Miami here, or maybe North Miami Beach, one of those two, where they had a ban on gardens in the front of your yard, right? And then there was, an elderly woman, an elderly couple, I believe, from Jamaica, that they wanted a garden in their front yard. And so they planted it and they got, liens put on their house. They had all these terrible things happen to them. And then the state of Florida came in and said, you know what? Like, that is a bad local law. Like, you might have passed it locally, but it's affecting something fundamental, some fundamental right that we have. And so we're going to step in and say, you can't make that kind of ban. And when they lifted the ban, there was a whole media event where, the woman came out and she was able to garden again. And it was like, okay, like, things like that, that's where preemption, I think, makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. And it's the same reason why, big government had to step in and stop segregation. I mean, because if you let everything be decided at a hyper local level on questions of civil rights, something as fundamental as that, you can have absurd outcomes where like just racism is legal here, then you can, black people are not allowed in this town and they're allowed in that town. So that is an important thing. Like, it's not bad in general. There are legitimate ways that it can be yielded, right? And one of those is those fundamental rights kind of things. But to your point, increasingly a lot of the way that it's being used is almost in like messaging, political messaging, and specifically from the Republican Party to just cities in general, because a lot of them are not even necessarily Democratic cities. It's just like cities dealing with city problems that are trying to come up with solutions to them. And then the state Republican Party saying like, no, don't you even think about that. And actually, we're going to take that option off your plate. Like, that tool you want to use, you cannot do it. Don't even think about it. And it's yielded in that way as a kind of messaging tool of like, we're the ones in charge, you're not in charge. And so, don't even think about it. There was a second part of your question I can't remember.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I remember exactly, but the point you raised too about like it's constantly drilled to me by like serious policy people that, preemption itself is a neutral tool, right? So like you say, when you're sort of protecting individual rights and protecting, sort of like consumer focused or people focused type of stuff, that can be important. When you're setting like a baseline standard of things, those can be really important preemptions. It's funny that you mentioned that what you're describing about a kind of the messaging preemption. It makes me think of like, yeah, I could add a category. I might even call it like petty preemptions. And I'm thinking of like just this past session, we had a situation, and it came out of Winter Park, which is like a wealthy suburb here in Orlando, where they had an ordinance going into effect to ban gas leaf blowers. And I will tell you, just as someone I can't stand gas leaf blowers. I think they're loud. I wish they were all gathered up and fired into the sun. Also, don't think it's one of the most important issues facing Florida. Don't really care if a community wants to ban or allow it. But the state senator from this area, a Republican state senator, decided this was an issue he was going to take on, and essentially tried to sneak some language into the state budget, stopping communities from regulating gas leaf blowers. It's just like, this is what we're spending our time on. Like there are sort of, to your point, there's almost messaging things. I'm also thinking now of, the governor made a big deal a couple of years ago.
He vetoed a bill that would have banned plastic straws,
Yeah,
and
that's
then
right.
he said in his veto message, he's like, listen, like, this is not that big of a deal. Like, let cities do this little thing. I mean, plastic
Right.
bags, it's, they cannot do that. Cities cannot ban plastic bags, but we will let them ban plastic straws, which is strange.
Right. Yeah, there's not logical consistency is not a sort of highly valued characteristic in Tallahassee sometimes. One thing, so I recently did a show, and when I say a show, it's just basically me barking into a microphone, but about it was looking at the way the governor has gotten very aggressive in using his executive suspension powers, his ability to suspend local officials, and he's done so in a way that I don't believe we've ever seen other governors do, where he's essentially suspending, particularly in this case, state attorneys, but also some school board members over what amount to policy disagreements. And I bring that up because as I was thinking through that and working on that, I remember it occurred to me that this is kind of a different sort of preemption or home rule that you're not taking a power away from a local government official, you're taking the local government official away. And that got me wondering, and I'm curious your thoughts on what are some of the other ways we see this kind of Tallahassee local government clash play out that isn't beyond sort of straight preemptions. Are there things that come to mind for you in terms of, how else they're sort of going at this?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to mind was last year in early 2023, there was an effort rolled out that was several years in the making to come up with a bail reform here in Miami-Dade County, and it was an effort. It was between the prosecutor, the state attorney, the court system itself, the clerk of courts, the public defender. It was this whole overall overarching approach, including, like, as I said, from the courts. Right, they were heavily involved in this, and this was something that was it was cooking for several years. As soon as they came out and they said, yes, we're kind of working on this reform, the governor came in and really killed the whole thing. They didn't have to. Have to pass a bill. They didn't have to do much else. He basically was able to come in and just implicitly just say, you really don't want to do that. Like,
Wow.
nip this in the bud. And this was just, shortly after, I believe, Andrew Warren, the prosecutor, was suspended from Hillsborough County. Kind of, and I was looming over this, and he killed it. That effort at reform, several years in the making, was just dead in the water. Like, that's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, that it is. It's actually a pretty crazy thing that can happen.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that, like, when something like that happens, and for I imagine anybody listening to this probably knows the Andrew Warren story, but that was the independently elected state attorney in Hillsborough County, Tampa, who the governor suspended. They came up with a bunch of reasons, but once you got into the court records, it was essentially entirely over abortion, because this prosecutor had signed on to a statement saying after the Dobbs decision, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, he'd signed on to a statement saying that he was not going to, he was not going to criminalize or prosecute women seeking abortion or doctors providing abortions. And so the governor used that as a reason to suspend him. But it was he fashioned it as rhetorically and in sort of his executive orders, also part of an effort to crack down on, reformist prosecutors, people trying to engage in kind of criminal legal system reform. And sort of hearing that story, it's a reminder that, when they take out one person, it's not just about that person. It's also about like scaring others into acting, and we have a prosecutor here who was eventually suspended as well, for very similar
Aramis Ayala,
reasons.
right? No,
No, this was
sorry,
Monique Morel. In
sorry.
fact,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right.
No, and I'm glad you bring her up because just not to go way off tangent, but like to make the point of just how much more aggressive DeSantis has become. So our previous state attorney was Aramis Ayala, and she got headlines nationally because she announced sort of out of the blue that she was not going to ever seek the death penalty in any case. Um, I am personally opposed to the death penalty, so I didn't have any problems with it. She didn't say it when she was running for election, so that was kind of you probably ought to let voters know that's going to be your position. So it was somewhat controversial. Rick Scott didn't remove her from office over that. What he did was he used his executive power to take death penalty cases away from her and assign them to a different prosecutor. Ron DeSantis now, for a far lesser sort of issue, is now removing people entirely, and it's sort of as the point you're making there. I think it's a lot of it is designed to stop other people from acting because they're thinking they're going to be looking over their shoulder.
And a point I really want to nail down here and make it very clear is, and through the course of my job, I talk to people from the whole range of the political spectrum, including many Republican office holders, even if they're in a nonpartisan position, they're Republicans. And they talk about this and they know it, right? They know that they can't do things because Tallahassee, and there's a general grumbling of like, we can't do this because Tallahassee is going to shoot it down. I'm like, literally, I hear that all the time, and it precludes people from wanting to do something from doing it because they know it's not worth the effort. So it's like a self-chilling effect. It's a self-censorship at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It can make people so cynical as to not act because they sort of assume it's all hopeless.
And they're kind of right,
right?
Because they've seen it time and time again.
Yeah. I sometimes get guilty of this. I remember when I was first reading about the heat preemption or the attempt in Miami to pass the heat illness standard. And I was writing a newsletter where just rounding up some different headlines around the state. And so I was including like I think it was like a Miami Herald story about it. And the headline I put on it was like the first preemption of 2024, right? Like clearly they're not going to let this stand, but you shouldn't let it, if you're someone trying to like improve your community, you can't let that stop you from trying.
Just to piggyback off that, like think about what that actually does to a democracy on a local level. It means that over time, there's less and less things you can actually campaign about, that you can actually make people care about on your city council or on your county council. It's like, why are you going to run on the platform of doing XYZ when all of the authority to do any of the above has been taken away from you? Like the scope of things that you can actually do anything about at a local level where elections really matter the most is being chipped away at. It's like the range of our strongest democracy, which is at the local level, is just like, it's just being chiseled away.
Yeah. I was going to ask this a little later, but this is a good time. In doing all the reporting that you guys have done on this stuff, one thing I'm always curious about is do people understand what's going on? Like if you're a voter in Orange County where, we just had, they voted for rent control a couple of years ago and when I say rent control, it was 1 year, no more than 10%. You could raise rent up to 10%, exclusive of your cost, by the way. So it's like if your cost went up, it was 10% on top of that, but still it got preempted, and I wonder, like, do voters in Orange County that like went through a whole campaign and see like, oh, we're going to get rent control in here and nothing ever happens. Do they know why that is? And like, what's your sense? Do average folks, do they understand it's like state government and state politicians coming in and stepping in, or they just think like the whole system's a mess, or what's your sort of sense?
I think it's a mixed bag. And then, some people understand it, some people don't. Even when it was clear that, that the state was already preempting rent control, you had some advocacy groups here in Miami holding rallies like rent control. And I talked to some of them, I'm like, like you can't do that. Like they took that away. But it's like a rallying point. I don't, and it does make people cynical of the whole system because you feel powerless in the face of it. But I do think there's some awareness of it. But at the end of the day, like even just the word preemption, like it's a wonky word. Like the concept is not that crazy, but it tends to be people that are really engaged in policy and whatnot that really understand the scope of what's going on, which is kind of unfortunate, right? I mean, it's like, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Every time I write a story about a preemption, as soon as I first hit that word, I'm like, there's got to be a better way to say this, and I could never land on one that doesn't
It's a
sound
ban.
like either. Yeah, that's right. A ban on often it's a ban on bans of some kind. Um, I want to stick with one question we were talking about, or one issue we were talking about earlier, and the different ways this manifests itself. So, like another example that comes to mind for me is um, I believe it was last year, the state legislature passed a law essentially stripping control of the power company in Gainesville from the city. So this is a city-owned, taxpayers of Gainesville own the electric company, this local electric company. The legislature passed a law that took that away and gave it to the governor, essentially a board appointed by a governor. And so now if you're a Gainesville Electric, I think it's GRU, is Gainesville Regional Utilities, the name of it. If you're a customer of them, you can no longer like petition your local elected officials for changes, or if you're unhappy with something there, your governor is who you need to go through to try and get change there. And that struck me as that's another, and maybe instead of preemption specifically, it's more of like home rule issues. So it's more of an erosion of home rule. Are there other ways you've seen it happen too? Are there ways that come to mind? Like I know you did like a great segment on I think, what did they call it? The Local Business Protection Act, I think. Is that the one where businesses can sue to enjoin ordinances they don't like? Or
That's right, and we haven't seen that used a whole lot 'cause a version of it did pass. Um,
yeah, that's right.
I think that's I remember that happening in Gainesville, and I followed it, kind of from a distance, and it was very notable. But there's very few things like that I can recall off the top of my head where there's like, essentially a public company being stripped away. There are
Yeah.
there are
So
other municipal um, power companies throughout the state. I believe the Gainesville one, part of what like made it so that the state could take it over was that the company operated outside the municipal borders. So then they said like, no, it's not just Gainesville, it's further out. That's a pretty extreme case, actually, though.
yeah, we haven't seen anything like it. Although you start to, just to the point we were talking about earlier about like you start to feel shadow effects. So there's a debate going on locally with the Orlando Utilities Commission, another municipally owned by the city of Orlando, where I won't get too into the weeds for folks that aren't here for like a net metering discussion, but they're working on a policy that would be pretty anti-rooftop solar, and it's a policy sort of that's really supported like the big investor-owned utilities, the private utilities like Florida Power and Light would like to get rid of this thing called net metering that's in place in a lot of in the state in a lot of different places. So OUC is working on a policy where it might get rid of of net metering itself for its own customers. And I do not know if this is true, but like one of the whispers you hear as you talk to people is that OUC people kind of feel like if they gotta do this, they gotta play ball, because if they upset FPL too much, if they upset like power brokers in Tallahassee too much, they're going to pass a bill taking away OUC from the city of Orlando, right? No idea if that would actually happen, but it just speaks to that issue we were talking about the chilling effect that happens from when you start to act on all this stuff.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and those kind of actions, of course, will create some sense of trepidation or whatnot. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, but Orlando is thinking about enacting that. That's interesting.
Yeah, OUC is working on they may eliminate net metering. I think it's looking like there might be a vote this September or something. Although I got to be honest, I haven't like drilled way down. Um, you know, you mentioned earlier the Miami Beach case. That was always fascinating. The Miami Beach living wage, minimum wage case, and that was always fascinating to me because the origin of that was there was some ambiguity into whether or not the original statewide minimum wage constitutional amendment essentially undid the state law that banned cities from having a local living wage ordinance themselves. And so, it was the legal argument was probably stronger on the industry side of the debate, but it was somewhat of a gray area. So this is how they ended up this is how Miami ended up going to court on this, or thinking they had some wiggle room. And the case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court initially said it was going to hear this case. And so it was somewhat, there was going to be a decision one way or the other. And then Ron DeSantis is elected, and he immediately gets 3 appointments. So he essentially changes half the court in one fell swoop. And the court changes his mind, decides not to take the case, which allows this lower court ruling, which was against the city, allows that lower court ruling to stand. This is all a very long-winded way of setting up a question like, how important are the courts in this? Because one of the things about the Florida Constitution is there's some pretty broad home rule powers for local governments in there. So these preemptions that get passed, they are in, at minimum, in tension with the home rule provisions of the Florida Constitution. So a lot of this comes down to like a judge trying to balance, legislative power versus home rule power. And so, in your experience in looking at this stuff, how important are the courts in sort of deciding these kinds of cases?
The courts are extremely important in some cases and not at all important in some cases.
Right.
But one of the episodes that we did was about the all the kerfuffle about like mask mandates in schools in 2021, and the courts played a very important role in that because it wasn't just like a bill. Like, these were things that were coming down from the state commissioner on education and regulations and whatnot. And then, on some level, it goes into like what's in the state constitution. And school boards constitutionally have a very big degree of autonomy, right? They are fully charged with protecting the welfare and the safety of those children. Like, that's not the state doing that. And, so it's ultimately up to a judge in a case like that to decide, like, is the state overstepping those boundaries here? And you had a bunch of school districts across the state saying, no, we are autonomous. We have the right to do this. Let us do this. And then, you had to go to the courts and in the end. So that's where the rubber hits the road for the courts. But for some things, it's like a law that's written, no ambiguity. It's like, thou shalt not do this. And then it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of, that's the episodes you did, probably the most fascinating one to me, and certainly not an issue I had ever thought about in any depth until listening to Tallahassee Takeover was the way preemption, or maybe I should say it as like concentration of power in one level of government, has been a tool of authoritarian rule. And I think you guys focused in on Venezuela, if memory serves. And I'm wondering, like, could you maybe explain to folks, how is that? How have authoritarians sort of used this kind of dynamic? And how does it, if it does, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that how does it parallel to what we've seen here, if it does parallel at all?
I don't want to draw one-to-one conclusions or one-to-one parallels, but on some level, like, I can say it is one of the primary tools in an authoritarian toolkit. If you're an authoritarian, you want to diminish the political power of anyone that's not in agreement with you. And often in a whole country, that's people elected at the local level. And so we looked at it, we kind of paired, this was, in the wake of the George Floyd protest, where there was this really big pushback, and a bill that ultimately passed in Tallahassee said, if any city reduces the budget for the police department, the governor and the cabinet can override it, which is frankly insane. But passing a budget at a local level, like, that is the thing that local governments are required to do. Like, that is the one thing that they need to do. Like, by Well, exactly. And you know, regardless of how someone feels about, you know, if you can or should raise or lower, you know, a budget, it's like that was a major step in taking authority away from cities, right? And then we talked about, and then with my colleague Tim Paget, who lived and worked in Venezuela for a long time, you know, veteran Latin American journalist, him and I kind of unpacked what happened in Venezuela when with the rise of Hugo Chavez. And one of the main things that we focused on in that episode was exactly that. It was an opposition mayor, a more conservative mayor in the Caracas area, who came up with different programs that varied from the socialists that were in charge of how to deal with the crime problem. And the centralized Chavista government did not like it. And they did everything that they could to thwart his authority, to prevent him from doing those programs, because it kind of offered a separate vision of how politics could work. You know, you ride this way or you ride that way. And they basically took the power and the control away from him, you know, and ultimately drove him out of the country. I mean, that hasn't really happened here in Florida. I don't want to say it is, but you know, but if you look across the world at you know, my family's from Cuba, right? There's not really any local governments of concern in Cuba. They all fall under the centralized government system. They all fall in line. So you don't have the mayor of Havana being a pain in the ass to the people at the federal level. They're all in line by design. And then, you know, it's not just, you know, in socialist countries and authoritarian right-leaning countries like Hungary. Viktor Orban has taken many actions against opposition mayors. I mean, they still have them, but he's taken and stripped authority away from them systematically to control more power in himself, to centralize it. Same thing in Turkey with President Erdogan. Same thing in Russia. I mean, they're like, these are places that do not allow for local opposition. You know, like, to the extent that democracy is there, it's like it has to be their way. Like, even if you elect the guy that you like, he can't do the policies that you might like because he has to fall in line. And you know, that's kind of the ultimate danger when you take the thread of, you know, just squashing local decision making to its end. It's like, well, then you don't really have a democracy anymore. Then you're just, you know, everyone's following the lead of whoever's at the top. And then this system we have in this country, this federalized system where it's supposed to be bottom up, it doesn't work. If you centralize it, it doesn't work. And, you know, a lot of states in this country are, you know, somewhat moving towards that way. Tennessee does this a lot. Texas is increasingly doing it. Florida is doing it a lot. And then, you know, and on the other side, California engages in it on some level too, you know, where there's more Republican leaning parts of the state, and they do bans on bans or whatever, more in a progressive direction. But some of that always happens. But, you know, once it reaches a fever pitch, it's really alarming for the health of a democracy.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's incredibly chilling. um, maybe that might be a good place to kind of like bring it in for a landing. But I am sort of curious to get your sense on sort of where you think this goes next in Florida, or does it just continue with sort of like, do we do this forever? Do we just like, is it one big game of whack-a-mole where a city tries to do something, the legislature keeps taking that away? Or, you know, I've often joked that like it's just a matter of time till like they wipe out the municipal government in like Gainesville or something like that, you know?
Well, like last year there was a kind of a joke of a proposal for a bill, but there was a bill that was like floated of like, why don't we just abolish the city of Key West?
Right. I remember that.
And Key West is extremely angry at the Florida government, because every time Key West does something, like, they have a very strong ethos of direct democracy in Key West, and so they tend to pass things that the state government doesn't like, but they're also what the people want, you know. But you know, I don't know exactly where it goes, but I saw something this week that made me say, well, that's interesting. And I'm gonna go overseas for it though. But the Labour government just won in a landslide election in the UK, right? So after 14 years of conservative power, Labour took over. One of the first things the new prime minister did is he brought all these mayors from around the country into London, the 10 Downing Street. And afterwards, they did like a press conference, and Keir Starmer, the new prime minister, and the mayors were saying, he says he's going to give the cities their power back. Because they, like, as a country, they were going through the same kind of thing. Like the big cities, London, they couldn't do a lot of things that they wanted to do. Their power was stripped away from them. And then now there's, a new government, and the cities are being told like, hey, we're going to get some power back. And they're like, oh my God, we can finally do something. And, like seeing that actually, just the headline, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like it can actually be reversed if there's a will for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That'll be fascinating to see how that plays out. Well, listen, I will wrap it up there. Thank you for doing this, and hopefully, thanks for all you're doing, and maybe we can have you back sometime to talk about some of the other kick-ass stories you've been writing. So I really appreciate you taking the time, though.
Yeah.
You bet. That does it. Thank you again to Danny Rivero for agreeing to come on to the show. As I mentioned, he's a reporter at WLRN. He's doing fantastic stuff, not just about preemption. He had a fantastic story recently about citizens' property insurance. I would encourage you to check out his work. As I said at the top of the show, I really do think he's one of the best public policy reporters in the state of Florida right now. As always, if you haven't already, please sign up for a subscription to Seeking Rents. The easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are ever behind any paywall. As always, I like to mention there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford it. If you do have the means to do so, please think about signing up for one of those voluntary paid subscriptions. The money we raise through these voluntary subscriptions are really important to helping cover, reporting expenses like public records requests. There's often charges associated with getting those records requests returned, or even right down to things like this microphone. So if you've got the means, please think about supporting our work. It really does help. Okay, we'll be back again soon. Until then, thanks so much for listening.